May 1838, northern Georgia. Mist rises over ridges once home to Cherokee families. Today we step into a march that history tried to erase. What would you carry if your home was taken tomorrow? 20th May 1838, Cherokee lands, northern Georgia, present-day Georgia, United States. The morning air hangs heavy with the scent of damp earth and smoke. Mist curls along the ridges, hiding the contours of the hills, while distant drums, sometimes the hooves of cavalry, echo faintly through the forest. Children clutch blankets, mothers tug at worn moccasins, and elders move with the careful rhythm of long years spent reading the land. Every shadow seems to stretch with foreboding. The trees themselves shiver in a wind that carries more than cold. It carries orders, decrees, and an invisible hand reshaping the map of their world. Along the narrow trails, small bands gather what they can carry. Axes, blankets, pottery, objects of daily life, suddenly heavy with the weight of imminent loss. A young scout pauses on a ridge, eyes tracing the horizon where smoke rises from distant settlements. Horses paw nervously. A murmured warning passes between neighbors. Something is coming, and it is unstoppable. The Cherokee know this morning is not like others. The whispers of removal have become marching orders. The ink on federal papers, words too light to weigh the lives they command, has already begun to redraw the boundaries of their homeland. By nightfall, history will have shifted. Trails will be stained with tears. Maps will be rewritten. Families will scatter. And yet amidst fear, a quiet determination lingers, survival memory, and the hope that one day the world will remember. Where are we, and what is about to unfold in these hills? The answer lies in the footsteps soon to trace the trail of tears, and in the voices of those who will not be erased. By the early months of 1838, the Cherokee Nation, spread across the rolling ridges and fertile valleys of northern Georgia, stood at a crossroads that no map could capture. The hills, once dotted with homesteads and cornfields, were being watched not just by neighbors, but by an expanding federal hand. Washington, D.C. had issued mandates signed into law over a decade earlier that now gathered force like a storm pressing against the mountains. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, a legislative instrument cloaked in promises of voluntary relocation and protection, was the first crack in a map that had long defined sovereignty and identity for the Cherokee. Political pressures had been mounting steadily. Georgia legislators, eager to extend state authority over fertile lands, had nullified Cherokee laws within state borders, declaring treaties irrelevant and tribal governance illegal. County courts issued writs against tribal leaders. Militias patrolled paths previously safe for hunters and messengers. For many, the arrival of a surveyor or the distant sound of gunfire meant the invisible lines on a federal map had begun to dictate the fate of entire communities. Cherokee leaders, principally Principal Chief John Ross, and a council of elders wrote petitions traveling to Washington, appealing to the president and Congress, but these pleas collided with political momentum favoring white settlement. The imbalance of power was stark. A sovereign people confronted by laws designed for removal, backed by the state militia and federal troops. Economic forces compounded the tension. The discovery of gold in Dahlonega, Georgia in 1828 had set off a rush that disrupted long-standing Cherokee agriculture and trade networks. Traders, miners, and settlers pressed ever closer to the valleys, where families had grown corn and raised livestock for generations. Roads that once carried wagons full of surplus crops now carried speculators and agents assessing land for sale, taxation, and extraction. Traditional hunting grounds shrank under private claims, and trade routes, critical for exchanging goods with neighboring tribes and European-American merchants, were rerouted or blocked. Families who relied on the Cherokee trading system found themselves cut off from markets and supplies, making subsistence precarious. The land itself, fertile, rolling, and mineral-rich, had become the currency of expansion, and the Cherokee were systematically priced out of their own territory. Social pressures deepened the fracture. Missionaries, both Protestant and Catholic, sought to civilize Cherokee society according to European-American norms, encouraging schools' written literacy and adoption of farming implements. While these efforts often offered literacy and survival skills, they were also used to justify removal, portraying the Cherokee as ready for relocation rather than independent actors on their own land. Diseases, measles, smallpox, and influenza had swept through the population in sporadic waves, weakening families already stressed by land disputes and food shortages. Communal gatherings, long the backbone of social cohesion, were disrupted by state patrols, forced surveys, and rumors of impending expulsion. Among villages, uncertainty and fear spread faster than the printed decrees ever could. In combination, these political, economic, and social pressures reshaped the map of power. The once clear boundaries of Cherokee territory, marked by rivers, ridges, and sacred sites, were being overlaid with new alien lines drawn on paper in distant offices. County borders, state authority, and federal instructions pressed inward, squeezing communities into corridors that led inexorably toward removal. Families began packing supplies, moving livestock, and gathering children, knowing that every day of delay increased the likelihood of violence and forced compliance. The landscapes of the North Georgia hills were transforming from homelands into corridors of exile. Even as the Cherokee sought counsel from their leaders, elders, and neighboring tribes, they could feel the map fracturing beneath their feet. Rivers no longer marked safe passage. Forests no longer shielded them. Each surveyor, each militia patrol, each government emissary represented the tangible manifestation of forces that would soon converge into a singular devastating campaign. The question on everyone's lips, spoken quietly by parents to children in the hush of dawn, was the same one historians would ask decades later. Where are we, and where will this forced journey take us? By the spring of 1838, the cracks in the map were no longer theoretical. Petitions had failed. Gold fever, political ambition, and legal manipulations had drawn a line that no Cherokee family could cross without stepping into the unknown. The community braced itself, knowing that the decisions made in state houses and the orders written on federal papers would soon rewrite the geography of survival and death, displacing thousands and reshaping history itself. John Ross was born in 1790, a son of mixed heritage Scots-Irish father, Cherokee mother, within the rolling hills of Uthcaloga, present-day Calhoun, Georgia. From an early age, Ross learned the rhythms of two worlds. He spoke both Cherokee and English fluently, a skill that would later define his role as an intermediary between his people and the U.S. government. By adolescence, he had witnessed the encroachment of settlers on tribal lands and the erosion of Cherokee autonomy. Even as a boy, he carried the weight of observation, who entered the valleys which rivers were navigable, where hunters struck the deer paths first. His adulthood, marked by the rising tension of Georgia's expansionist policies, forged a leader whose motivations were clear yet complicated. Ross desired sovereignty and survival, a preservation of Cherokee lands without sacrificing the community. His fear was tangible: the destruction of his people's social fabric, the forced removal from ancestral lands, the scattering of families whose roots ran deep into the valleys and ridges of northern Georgia. He moved through the council houses with a quiet authority, a ceremonial pipe at hand, notes and petitions tucked into satchels slung across his shoulder, each item a tool for negotiation for survival. Ross's family ties reinforced his role as guardian. Cousins, nephews, and clansmen looked to him not only as a political leader, but as a living embodiment of Cherokee continuity. He maintained correspondence with sympathetic politicians in Washington, but he also walked among his people daily, attending ceremonies, listening to oral histories, visiting the sick, and comforting those whose lands had already been claimed by surveyors. Every handshake, every shared meal, every whispered instruction carried the weight of generations. The objects he carried were not mere artifacts. They were extensions of his responsibility. A ledger of treaties and petitions contained the names and lands of Cherokee villages. A small silver pocket watch, given to him by a trader, tracked the hours until militia patrols arrived. A ceremonial knife rested at his belt, a symbol of both authority and the delicate balance between peace and defense. When Ross traveled to Washington to plead with the federal government, these objects accompanied him, tangible evidence of a culture and a people under siege. Amid this turbulence, Ross's decisions were constrained by forces far beyond his control. He sought compromise, advocating for relocation agreements that promised minimal suffering while resisting any notion of surrender that would erase the Cherokee nation entirely. His choices were a delicate negotiation between pragmatism and principle, often criticized by his contemporaries for conceding too little or too much depending on perspective. But for Ross, the priority remained: keep the people intact, keep the culture alive, and navigate the storm of removal without total annihilation. Living among the Cherokee, Ross observed the everyday struggles of families preparing for forced relocation. Women packed pots, blankets, and corn, tucking in keepsakes from cabins soon to be abandoned. Children clutched dolls stuffed with care as if the soft cotton could preserve some sense of home. Hunters secured what livestock they could. Elders recounted oral histories of migration, of survival, of promises made and broken. Ross's presence, often understated, became a stabilizing force, someone who could translate fear into coordinated action, despair into communal resilience. He witnessed countless small acts of courage: a young mother guiding her children through hidden paths to gather firewood, an elder negotiating with a soldier to delay a village evacuation, a scout reporting on troop movements along narrow ridges. These moments, though minor in the scale of political maneuvering, defined the texture of survival for thousands. Ross himself became a conduit, carrying intelligence from village to village, petitioning state authorities and documenting incidents with the precision of a meticulous scribe. Yet fear remained constant. Every encounter with federal agents, every new order, each surveyor's footprint in Cherokee lands reminded Ross that time was slipping. He feared for families separated during forced marches, for villages stripped of provisions, for the spiritual toll of moving sacred objects, burial mounds, and ceremonial grounds. His empathy did not cloud his judgment, it sharpened it. The balance between caution and leadership defined his daily life. Through letters, council records, and later oral histories, we glimpse the weight he bore. Negotiating peace while aware of inevitable suffering, translating law while knowing the law was wielded to dispossess, witnessing sorrow while maintaining authority. Each decision, each journey, each interaction was both tactical and moral, inextricably tied to the fate of the Cherokee people. By tracing Ross's movements across the rolling valleys, we see the Cherokee world through a human lens. Decisions over petitions and treaties intersected with the rhythm of daily life. Fires being stoked in cabins, children crying for food, livestock corralled for survival, the soft murmur of elders recounting ancestral tales. The material culture, blankets, clay pots, tools, ceremonial pipes served as anchors in a storm, physical reminders of identity amid imminent upheaval. Ross's role crystallized the question that would haunt generations. Who leads a people when laws, maps, and treaties conspire against their survival? In him, the Cherokee saw a reflection of their history, their present, and the uncertain path ahead. His motivations were clear: protect families, preserve traditions, and resist erasure. His fears were real displacement, death, and cultural dissolution. His decisions would ripple through the lives of thousands, guiding them through a landscape both familiar and suddenly alien. As the spring of 1838 unfolded, Ross's figure, satchel on shoulder, ceremonial pipe in hand, ledger under arm, became the axis around which the Cherokee nation turned. From village council houses to ridges overlooking forests, his presence reminded them of continuity's strategy and hope, however fragile. In the chaos of forced removal, he was a human tether, connecting the dispersed, speaking for the silenced, and navigating the fractured map of sovereignty, survival, and identity. May 23, 1838, Ross's camp, near the foothills of northern Georgia, present-day Murray County, Georgia, United States. The morning broke with a chill, the dampness of overnight rain still clinging to the rolling hills. Smoke from the chimneys of small cabins mingled with the mist rising from the valleys. John Ross, satchel slung over his shoulder, stood near the edge of the clearing, listening to the rustle of leaves and the distant clatter of hooves. He had expected the arrival of federal troops, but the reality of it lined up along the ridge, bayonets glinting in muted sunlight, hit like a sudden storm. Orders had arrived days before, carried by a courier from the state militia. Cherokee must evacuate their lands by May 25th. Compliance is required. Non-compliance will be met with force. The words printed in a neat hand carried the weight of authority and the inevitability of action. Families hurried to gather what little they could: blankets, cooking pots, tools, and keepsakes handed down through generations. Even the small ledger containing village names and lands which Ross had guarded carefully was now folded into a pack to be carried along narrow trails. Across the valley, drums echoed the cadence of preparation. Children clung to their mothers, some too young to comprehend the significance of leaving, others old enough to understand the fear in the air. Livestock were herded into temporary pens. Dogs whined and tugged at leashes, sensing the tension. Every movement, every sound reinforced a singular truth: the Cherokee homeland, as it had been known for generations, was slipping from their grasp. The first confrontation came quietly, but unmistakably. Militiamen approached the edge of Ross's camp, demanding a roll call and verification of families present. Resistance was not an option, though anger simmered in the elders' eyes. One young father, clutching the hand of his daughter, attempted to question the legality of the orders, only to be met with a stern gesture, and the cold logic of enforcement. Compliance was mandatory. This interaction, though brief, signaled the point of no return. By midday, the community understood that the forced march, what would become the Trail of Tears, had begun. There was no turning back. Small groups began moving along the muddy paths, carrying whatever possessions could be transported. Ross walked among them, coordinating, offering counsel, trying to maintain order and calm. The practicalities of survival merged with the emotional weight of departure. Sacred sites passed in silence, homes locked for the last time, gravesites visited for brief prayers. Even as families moved, signs of impending hardship were immediate. Streams that had once provided clear water for drinking and washing were now crowded with people and animals, the banks eroding under the strain. Children stumbled over exposed roots and rocks. Elders slowed the pace, leaning on walking sticks or younger family members. Food provisions were limited. Hunting was impractical along the narrow, crowded paths. Every misstep, every delay heightened the vulnerability of the group. Ross recorded the event meticulously in his journal, later noting the juxtaposition of routine and upheaval. Today, the Cherokee began their removal. The paths we have known are now passages of sorrow. Families old and young move as one, yet the weight of separation presses upon all hearts. The first day was not merely the start of a journey. It was the ignition point of a collective trauma where law, military enforcement, and human endurance collided. By evening, the landscape itself had shifted. Hills once familiar now framed the march with an ominous new perspective. Smoke from cooking fires mingled with the haze of exhaustion. Mothers whispered prayers for protection. Children huddled against blankets, shivering from both cold and fear. The villagers recognized with each step that the orders were irrevocable and that the map of their lives, homes, farms, sacred sites had been forcibly redrawn. The immediate consequences were clear separation of extended families, the disruption of agricultural cycles, and the erosion of village structures. Ross, walking the lines of moving families, understood that this moment, May 23, 1838, would define not just the next weeks, but the decades of Cherokee memory and survival. The spark had been lit, and the chain of events leading to exile, suffering, and survival was now in motion. The question that haunted the marchers was simple, yet profound. How do we move forward when our lands are no longer ours, and the path ahead is dictated by distant orders and unstoppable forces? Every step along the muddy trails, every glance at the ridge or river, was an answer in motion, a testimony of resilience even before the first mile was complete. May 24, 26, 1838, Valley Trails, Northern Georgia. Present day, Murray and Whitfield counties, Georgia, United States. The early morning mist clung to the slopes of northern Georgia, obscuring the ridges and the winding trails that threaded between them. Cherokee families, still gathering themselves after the abrupt departure from their villages, began moving along narrow, muddy tracks carved into the forest floor. Horses stumbled on roots slick from overnight rain. Children trailed behind, holding onto blankets, small bundles of possessions, and the hands of parents whose faces bore both determination and exhaustion. On the ridge to the east, a contingent of U.S. federal troops had positioned themselves, their orders clear: oversee the removal, prevent escapes, and enforce compliance. Their objective was straightforward: expedite the march of Cherokee families off the lands claimed by the state of Georgia. Yet on the ground, the terrain imposed constraints that neither maps nor orders could anticipate. Forested valleys intersecting streams and uneven ridges created natural choke points and concealed paths that the Cherokee scouts knew intimately. This local knowledge became both shield and leverage, allowing families to move cautiously, regroup, and preserve some degree of control over their route. The battle of movement, though, not fought with artillery or muskets, unfolded in subtle, decisive moments. Ross coordinated groups from one ridge to another, sending scouts to reconnoiter paths, identify streams suitable for fording, and locate makeshift resting points. Each crossing presented choices with immediate consequences. Too narrow a ford and wagons and livestock slowed. Too exposed a ridge and the militia could intervene. Too long a detour and provisions dwindled. Morale suffered and illness risked spreading. A critical pivot point occurred near a deep bend of the Conasauga River. Families carrying clay pots, woven baskets, and blankets were halted by rising water. The river, swollen from rain, rendered a direct crossing impossible. Ross consulted with scouts, young men and women who knew the hidden shallows, and rerouted the group along a wooded ridge, gaining a hidden passage. This detour, though minor in distance, prevented direct confrontation with a detachment of militia, positioned downstream, effectively avoiding early casualties and allowing families to maintain cohesion. The terrain itself had dictated the first tactical decision of the forced march. Along the ridge, every object and movement mattered. Livestock, horses, goats, chickens were corralled into narrow paths. Pots and blankets were secured against sudden spills or loss. Mothers kept children close, weaving their way through tree roots and fallen branches. A misstep, a dropped bundle, could slow the line and expose them to armed oversight. Yet the Cherokee adapted, turning knowledge of the landscape into survival strategy, transforming ordinary foraging and travel into acts of quiet resistance. At midday, an unforeseen complication arose. A small group of men sent to scout ahead misjudged the approach of a militia patrol. The warning signals, faint whistles, knocking sticks echoed along the ridges, alerting the families and Ross. The militia, misreading the scouts' movement, delayed pursuit, buying precious hours. This unintended miscommunication became a pivot moment. Families avoided immediate confrontation. The first day of the march continued largely intact, and the Cherokee leadership could reorganize scattered groups. A single error, yet its consequences positive in this instance, shifted the initial trajectory of the removal. The impact on the families was immediate. Relief mingled with exhaustion as they navigated the ridge detours, crossing small streams and pausing in forest clearings to rest. Livestock remained with them, children were accounted for, and supplies remained mostly intact. For Ross, the successful navigation reinforced the fragile balance of authority and community cohesion. The march was dangerous, yes, but not yet deadly. Yet the physicality of the terrain, mud routes, water crossings, and narrow ridges had already begun to shape outcomes. Decisions made here would echo across the following weeks, determining which families maintained unity and which were separated by missteps or necessity. Beyond the immediate logistics, the landscape imposed psychological pressure. The dense forest limited visibility, forcing trust in guides and scouts. Mist and rain, muted sounds making distant commands and signals critical. Every creek, bend, and slope became both obstacle and protective cover. Cherokee elders whispered instructions, children echoed them, and Ross walked the lines ensuring coordination. The natural environment dictated pace placement and interaction, revealing how geography could dictate the human story. By nightfall of the second day, the families reached a ridge overlooking a broader valley. Smoke from distant settlements reminded them that the militia's reach extended beyond the immediate trails. The marchers made camp, digging small trenches for livestock, placing sentries among elders and young men, and conserving firewood for the night. Ross convened a brief council of village representatives reviewing movements, supplies, and contingencies. The first tactical engagement of the march, mediated entirely by landscape timing and improvisation, had concluded with minimal immediate loss. Yet it foreshadowed the weeks of exhaustion, missteps, and forced choices that would define the Trail of Tears. The lesson of the set piece was clear. In the absence of conventional battle terrain, weather and movement became instruments of survival and strategy. Decisions made here, crossing a swollen river, rerouting along ridges, interpreting miscommunications, would have cascading effects. Families preserved cohesion, avoided early confrontation, and gained a fragile sense of agency in an otherwise predetermined expulsion. Yet the march was only beginning. Each ridge and valley from this point forward would continue to test endurance, coordination, and leadership, showing that even in forced exile, knowledge of the land could alter the human story. Late May 1938, ridge near the Conasauga River, northern Georgia. As the Cherokee families continued their march along the muddy forested trails, a discrepancy in records began to emerge. A discrepancy that would resonate through history. According to the official military reports filed by Major Ridge's detachment, the evacuation proceeded without incident, the Cherokee demonstrating willing compliance with orders and all families accounted for, and moving along predetermined paths. The report emphasized efficiency, the absence of resistance, and noted that minor delays were attributable to natural obstacles, swollen streams, fallen trees, and the muddy conditions of spring rains. Yet when comparing this account to Cherokee oral histories and personal diaries maintained by village elders, a very different picture arises. One elder, writing years later in his journal, recalled the chaos, fear, and desperation that marked the initial days of the march. Families were separated. Children cried as they lost sight of parents, livestock wandered off, and militia patrols advanced aggressively, forcing hurried crossings of swollen streams. The journal emphasizes moments of active resistance and negotiation, elders diverting militia from certain trails, parents hiding supplies, scouts signaling to regroup scattered groups. The mood described is one of anxiety and survival, not the orderly compliance portrayed in the official record. The contrasting accounts hinge on both perspective and intent. In the military report, the aim was to portray the removal as orderly, lawful, and efficient, a narrative designed for bureaucratic approval and to justify further policy implementation. Any act of resistance, confusion, or hardship would have undermined the perceived success of the operation. Language was deliberately neutral. Words such as compliance and accounted for gloss over the physical and emotional toll on the Cherokee. By contrast, the Cherokee account sought to preserve memory, to document the lived experience of displacement. The elders' diaries record the human dimension, exhaustion, sorrow, small victories, and the strategic thinking that allowed families to maintain some cohesion. A passage describes a mother holding two small children while crossing a narrow footbridge over a fast-moving stream, improvising with a branch for balance as militia officers shouted behind them. The detail is vivid, tactile, and rooted in sensory experience, capturing fear, resourcefulness, and communal effort elements absent from the military documentation. A specific incident illustrates the divergence clearly. A squad of militia attempted to force a crossing at the river bend. The official report notes the Cherokee moved promptly and without incident across the Conasauga. Yet, a diary entry from a Cherokee scout reads, "Men shouted, women screamed, the bridge trembled beneath us. We held our children, some animals fell in the water, and we guided them to safety using branches and ropes. Only by quick thinking did the group avoid serious injury." The event is the same, the forced crossing, but the emphasis, interpretation, and detail are entirely different. This collision of narratives raises questions about truth and authority. Why does the military account erase suffering? Why do oral histories highlight chaos and resilience? The answers lie partly in the purpose and audience of each document. The military report was submitted to superiors, a record to justify policy and expenditures. The Cherokee diary, in contrast, was a record of memory, a preservation of collective experience, and a means to transmit lessons of endurance to future generations. The implications of this discrepancy are profound. For contemporary historians, the challenge is not merely to decide which version is true, but to weave together multiple perspectives to reconstruct a fuller picture of events. The march, the terrain, and the human behavior involved cannot be understood fully through a single lens. Documents intended to convey control and efficiency may conceal the lived realities of trauma loss and courage. Meanwhile, personal testimonies illuminate agency, adaptation, and resilience that official papers deem unnecessary or inconvenient to record. As the march continued over the next days, Ross and other leaders relied on first-hand observation and coordination, guided by intimate knowledge of terrain and village movements. Their actions sometimes contradicted official expectations, sometimes circumvented orders to protect families. Scouts reported misaligned troop movements. Elders signaled adjustments. Children's cries and livestock strays dictated pauses. These adjustments, invisible in military reports, were recorded in diaries and oral accounts revealing a living strategy that official documents omitted. The contrast of narratives extends beyond the immediate march. Years later, congressional records would cite the efficiency of Cherokee removal as proof of policy success. Meanwhile, Cherokee descendants recount the disorientation, separation, and improvisation required to survive. The same events viewed through different lenses become either orderly compliance or extraordinary endurance in the face of forced displacement. This episode illustrates a central tension in archival documentary work. The truth of an event is multifaceted, shaped by perspective, purpose, and context. In the case of the Trail of Tears, the human experience, chaotic, fearful, adaptive, is often invisible in administrative records. Yet it persists in diaries, oral histories, and later testimonies. Reconciling these accounts provides not only a more accurate historical reconstruction, but also a moral and emotional understanding of the consequences of forced removal. By examining both accounts side by side, listeners are invited to question authority, interpret silence, and read between lines. The march, the river crossings, the cries of children, the guidance of elders, and the decisions of leaders like Ross all gain depth and nuance. The contrast between the official narrative and personal memory illuminates the complexity of human response under coercion, highlighting the courage, strategy, and resilience often obscured in bureaucratic records. Ultimately, the point of collision between these two sources, the official and the personal, is not merely disagreement. It is a window into understanding how power, narrative, and lived experience interact, and why the Trail of Tears remains a subject of deep historical reflection. It underscores the importance of listening to multiple voices, of tracing footsteps across both maps and memory, and of recognizing that the story of removal is as much about human endurance as it is about policy. Late May 1838. Ridge trails and valleys, northern Georgia to eastern Tennessee. Present-day Murray and Whitfield counties, GA to Polk County, TN. The second week of the forced march brought the Cherokee into narrower, more rugged terrain. Narrow trails wound through densely forested ridges, the soil slick from continuous spring rain. The cadence of travel quickened, driven by urgency, and the persistent pressure of militia patrols behind them. Ross walked among the families, satchel at his side, his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of troop movement. The soundscape was chaotic, yet patterned. The clatter of hoofbeats mingled with the clamor of children, the murmur of elders, and the occasional bark of a dog. Each sound carried information, direction, danger, reassurance. As families descended into a valley, the river crossing ahead presented a significant obstacle. Logs, makeshift bridges, and narrow fords required coordination. Women carried children across while balancing baskets of provisions. Men pushed livestock along the bank, improvising ropes to pull animals over slick rocks. The weather added urgency. A sudden squall of rain sent rivulets of water racing down the slopes, threatening both people and supplies. Every footstep demanded attention. Every pause carried risk. Meanwhile, militia detachments attempted to catch up their movement, slow but relentless. One officer, misjudging the depth of a river crossing, sent soldiers ahead who became trapped midstream, forcing a brief, tense standoff. Cherokee scouts seized the moment, guiding families to side paths through the forest. Ross issued silent signals directing movement, while ensuring children and the elderly remained protected. His decisions were both tactical and human, balancing efficiency with compassion. Alongside these logistical challenges were the intimate realities of displacement. A mother wrapped a blanket tightly around her infant, whispering reassurances in Cherokee. An elderly man stumbled, his cane slipping on mud, and a neighbor steadied him, murmuring words of encouragement. Items carried were not mere possessions, but anchors of memory. A carved wooden flute, a set of family plates, a bundle of woven blankets, each protected, fiercely carried through the exhaustion and uncertainty of every mile. At midday, the column encountered a ridge overlooking a settlement recently vacated by another tribe. Scouts reported militia positions, forcing Ross to alter the route abruptly. The shift disrupted the march, causing confusion among families. Children cried at the sudden halt. Livestock scattered slightly. A pot fell shattering against rock. Yet, through improvisation, messengers running ahead, elders organizing regrouping points, parents maintaining lines, the Cherokee maintained cohesion. The terrain, weather, and human improvisation intertwined to create a living choreography of survival. The tension escalated as another detachment of militia appeared downstream. Ross consulted with scouts and elders. Signals were passed along the line, whistles, taps on logs, gestures known only within the group. Families shifted silently into the forest, temporarily concealed. The militia misinterpreting shadows as routine movement paused, and the column passed undetected. The interplay of human observation and environmental advantage dictated the outcome. Even in these moments of success, the human cost was visible. Exhausted children leaned against parents. A woman fainted near a stream and was supported by her neighbors. Livestock were lost or injured in the scramble. Ross paused at each disruption, coordinating recovery while maintaining forward movement. The rhythm of life intertwined with the pace of removal. Personal grief, physical labor, and leadership decisions coalesced into a single continuous experience of survival under duress. The evening brought temporary reprieve on a slope above a smaller stream. Fires were lit, smoke curling into the cool air. Children played briefly with sticks and stones, laughter mingling with tears. Elders recounted old stories, anchoring memory in a moment of rest. Ross held council with village representatives, reviewing the day's movements, losses, and hazards ahead. The tension remained high. Tomorrow promised another series of ridges, crossings, and potential encounters. This set piece illuminates how human agency, environmental conditions, and unexpected developments shaped the trajectory of the Cherokee during the forced march. Every decision, from which path to take, how to ferry children across streams, how to coordinate signals, was critical. The interplay between landscape and human response determined not only immediate survival, but also the social cohesion and morale of the entire group. By nightfall, the Cherokee families had traversed several ridges, crossed multiple streams, and evaded at least 2 potential confrontations with militia patrols. The column settled into makeshift camps, tending to children, livestock, and possessions. Fires flickered, revealing faces lined with exhaustion and determination. Ross recorded movements and observations in a small notebook, noting not only paths and delays, but also acts of courage, improvisation, and mutual care that would become the foundation of oral histories. The lesson of this set piece is twofold. It demonstrates the escalation of tension inherent in forced relocation, and it situates human experience, fear, resourcefulness, and endurance at the center of historical narrative. Geographies, weather, and improvisation converge to define outcomes, illustrating that even in situations of coercion, knowledge, coordination, and adaptability could influence survival. Early June 1838, crossing the Tennessee River near present-day Chattanooga, Tennessee, United States. The column had been moving for days along narrow, rocky trails, descending from the ridges of northern Georgia toward the valleys of eastern Tennessee. Families trudged through mud and rain-soaked paths. Children clung to mothers, elders leaned heavily on walking sticks, and animals struggled beside baskets, blankets, and the few possessions they could carry. Each mile forward was a negotiation with terrain exhaustion and the relentless pressure of militia patrols behind them. By the second day of June, the Cherokee reached the Tennessee River, a broad, cold waterway swollen from spring rains. It was here at this crossing that the point of no return became painfully real. Ross, consulting with scouts and elders, knew that missteps would be disastrous. The river was both barrier and conduit. Crossing it required coordination, courage, and improvisation. Families were marshaled to the banks, ropes tied to trees, planks laid carefully across narrow logs, and children were passed hand to hand. The noise of rushing water mingled with cries and commands, creating a dissonant chorus of urgency, fear, and determination. The militia stationed downstream to enforce compliance observed the crossing. A misstep could trigger confrontation, injury, or separation of families. One child slipped from a mother's grasp, falling into the churning water. A neighbor dove in, securing the child and passing him up to safety. Ross and elders maintained order, moving groups systematically, but each moment felt precarious. The river itself dictated the pace, forcing difficult decisions: which families to prioritize, which items could be salvaged, and how to maintain cohesion under extreme stress. At the same time, tensions escalated within the column. Exhaustion, hunger, and fear provoked friction. A father argued with another parent over the route, insisting that a detour might protect livestock. Elders mediated. Ross intervened silently, signaling scouts to find a hidden ford that could accommodate the largest groups. Every small dispute, every logistical choice now carried profound consequences. The cohesion of families and the very survival of children and elders depended on careful leadership under duress. By late afternoon, the crossing was complete, but not without cost. Several animals were lost to the river, supplies were scattered, and the psychological toll on children and elders was visible in their silence, trembling, or quiet sobs. Ross, walking along the banks, recorded each incident, noting in his ledger the location, the families involved, and the improvisation required to maintain order. In his notes, he referred to the day simply as the crossing where the river claimed what maps could not. This moment marked the closure of one chapter and the opening of another. The Cherokee could not return to the homelands left behind in northern Georgia. The rivers, ridges, and valleys they had known were now behind them, replaced by uncertainty, and imposed paths leading westward. Letters, petitions, and negotiations had failed to prevent removal. The practical and symbolic separation was complete. The river crossing represented the physical manifestation of forced exile, a threshold they could not cross back. Throughout the evening, as the families regrouped, fires were lit along the riverbanks. Children huddled for warmth, elders recited prayers, and Ross convened a brief council. Reports of stragglers, lost items, and the condition of livestock were exchanged. The leaders recognized the irreversibility of the journey. Every action forward would compound the separation. Every choice would shape survival, and the landscape itself would continue to test endurance. The documents of the period reflect this moment starkly. Military records list the crossing efficiently. All families accounted for. March continued. Cherokee diaries, in contrast, capture the human drama: the child in the river, the exhausted parents, the whispered prayers, the improvisations to save life and property. These divergent accounts converge on one undeniable fact: the Tennessee River crossing was the literal and symbolic point of no return. From this moment, the Trail of Tears could not be halted. The trajectory of forced removal was irrevocable. In the night, as fires dimmed and shadows stretched across the riverbank, a quiet determination emerged among the Cherokee. The crossing had exacted its price: physical, emotional, and logistical, but it also reinforced the resilience and ingenuity of the community. Elders whispered strategies for the next day. Mothers checked children. Men reassured the elderly. Every act of care, every adaptive solution was a testament to survival amid coercion. By dawn, the consequences of the crossing had crystallized. Families were committed to the march westward. The homeland was irretrievably lost. Leadership decisions made during the crossing would influence cohesion, safety, and survival in the weeks to come. The river had drawn a line that could not be uncrossed. For the Cherokee, it was the first true acknowledgement that the removal was irreversible and that their lives as they had known them had been irrevocably altered. This moment, the crossing of the Tennessee River, stands as the high point of crisis and decision in the Trail of Tears. All subsequent events, hardships, and adaptations emanate from this juncture. Geographies, leadership, family cohesion, and improvisation intersected here to produce consequences both immediate and lasting. In the archival record, the river is both a witness and a marker, the final threshold of the familiar, the entrance into forced exile, and the point where history, as recorded and remembered, pivots forever. 1839 to 1850s. From northern Georgia to eastern Oklahoma, Trail of Tears resettlement regions. The crossing of the Tennessee River and the continuation of the march westward had irrevocably altered the map of Cherokee lands. Within a year, the immediate consequences of forced removal became tangible. Families arrived in the designated resettlement areas along the Arkansas and then Oklahoma territories. Villages that had once thrived in northern Georgia were replaced by makeshift camps, tents, and hastily built log cabins arranged along unfamiliar ridges and valleys. Crops planted years prior were lost. Fertile fields lay abandoned. Social structures once centered around the familiar layouts of towns and ceremonial grounds were fractured. Elders struggled to reestablish governance, while youth adapted to the new terrain, learning hidden paths and river crossings under the watchful eyes of Ross and remaining leaders. By 1840, the first post-removal treaties had been codified. The Treaty of New Echota, which had been a point of contention before the march, formalized the cession of Georgia lands to the United States. The treaty drew new boundaries across maps, signaling a shift in legal and political authority. Families who had been relocated now faced a landscape where the names of rivers, ridges, and valleys carried foreign titles. Sacred sites, burial mounds, and ancestral hunting grounds were either inaccessible or renamed by incoming settlers. The Cherokee, while preserving some continuity through leadership councils, experienced the erosion of place-based identity, a psychological toll, compounded by separation from homes, friends, and neighbors. Education and assimilation pressures soon followed. In the early 1840s, missionary schools and boarding institutions were established within the resettlement areas. Children were enrolled under the guise of literacy and Christian instruction, yet these schools disrupted traditional learning, communal storytelling, and kinship training. By 1845, children of several villages spoke English fluently, but often had fragmented knowledge of Cherokee rituals and language, creating intergenerational gaps. Ross and other leaders attempted to balance participation in these programs with preservation of cultural practices, but the struggle was ongoing. Over the next decade, the demographic and social consequences intensified. Villages slowly reformed, often merging displaced families from different regions, creating new community structures. Boundaries drawn on federal maps replaced old tribal divisions, and the Cherokee Nation's authority was both codified and constrained within territories designated by the U.S. government. Some elders chronicled these changes in journals, noting that traditional councils now convened along roads and riverbanks, dictated by government plots rather than ancestral geography. Livelihoods shifted, as families adapted to less fertile soil, unfamiliar game, and fluctuating water sources. Subsistence farming persisted, but crops were smaller and hunting less reliable. By the 1850s, 20 years after removal, the long-term consequences were evident. The Cherokee Nation had survived, but its landscape, both physical and cultural, had been profoundly altered. Names of towns and rivers were officially changed. Ceremonies once tied to specific locations now took place along new ridges and valleys. Ross, having passed in 1806, left a legacy of resilience, but communities continued to grapple with the fragmentation of extended families and the reconstruction of social cohesion in a land that had been forcibly imposed. The nation's governance structures were functional, yet constantly navigating the tension between imposed boundaries and inherited sovereignty. The human impact was as significant as the cartographic. Individual families, children, elders, and mothers carrying possessions adjusted to new land ownership rules, federal oversight, and disrupted kinship networks. Stories recorded in diaries, letters, and oral accounts emphasized a recurring theme: adaptation without surrender. While the maps had changed, the memory of the original homelands persisted, informing practices, stories, and rituals that continued despite displacement. This new map, both literal and symbolic, defined life in the years following the Trail of Tears. Villages reconstituted along the Arkansas River and in eastern Oklahoma were linked by rivers and trails, yet disconnected from ancestral lands. Legal documents and treaties codified U.S. authority, but cultural memory preserved knowledge of the former homelands. Leadership, spearheaded by Ross and other elders, maintained cohesion, yet each decision on resource allocation, settlement, planning, or education was constrained by geography, policy, and trauma. In sum, the consequences of the forced removal unfolded across three temporal layers. Immediate 1838 to 1839 physical displacement, loss of homes and crops, separation of families, onset of disease and exhaustion. Medium term 1840-1850 new legal boundaries, introduction of schools and missions, reconstruction of villages in unfamiliar terrain, gradual erosion of ancestral place names. Long-term, 1850s, 1860s, consolidation of communities under U.S.-imposed boundaries, adaptation of governance structures, cultural continuity maintained through memory. An oral tradition, despite loss of original homelands. The Cherokee Nation, while resilient, entered a landscape permanently altered by policy displacement and enforced migration. The maps of Georgia, Arkansas, and Oklahoma were rewritten not only in ink, but in the lived experience of thousands, shaping family leadership and memory for generations. The Trail of Tears had changed geography, politics, society, and identity, irreversibly producing a new map of survival, adaptation, and enduring cultural memory. Late 1850s present, former Cherokee lands, northern Georgia and Oklahoma resettlement areas. Decades after the forced removal, the landscapes once familiar to the Cherokee remained in part physically altered, but culturally alive. Hills, rivers, and valleys bore traces of abandoned villages, remnants of foundations, and overgrown paths where children once played. Yet the collective memory persisted, encoded in place names, songs, and ritual observances, preserving continuity in spite of displacement. One enduring trace is the sacred site near the Conasauga River, still known by its Cherokee endonym Tsalagi Ani Ivwea, place of the people. Elders recount ceremonies held quietly along the riverbanks, where prayers and offerings honor ancestors who began the march decades prior. These rituals, conducted annually, tie current generations to both the land and the experiences of those who endured the forced journey. Another element of resilience is the surviving oral songs composed during and after the march, which narrate loss, endurance, and memory. Children learn these songs in communal gatherings, often accompanied by percussion made from everyday items, wooden sticks, hollowed logs, and gourds. The melodies, simple yet haunting, transmit history, without words written on paper, embedding knowledge, emotion, and identity in rhythm and repetition. In listening, one senses the intimate bond between human memory and place, how stories adapt to survive in absence of original homesteads. A third living artifact is the family cemetery on a former ridge near Calhoun, Georgia, where tombstones mark those who died during or shortly after removal. Names, dates, and occasional symbols of Cherokee heritage remind visitors that the past is tangible. Descendants tend these sites, maintaining vegetation clearing paths and recording oral accounts associated with each grave. The act of caretaking transforms space into a living archive connecting memory, genealogy, and geography. Scholarly reflection underscores that memory is both spatial and performative. Endonyms, songs, and ceremonial sites act as repositories of knowledge, encoding experiences that official documents omit. Unlike governmental records that emphasize compliance and efficiency, these living archives capture the embodied experience of displacement, fear, grief, adaptation, and resilience. By engaging with these traces, researchers and community members alike can access layered understandings of history that include both policy impact and human agency. For the Cherokee, remembrance is practiced quietly through rituals and teaching rather than grandiose spectacle. Children learn not through textbooks alone, but by walking old trails, participating in river ceremonies, or hearing stories of ancestors' perseverance. The land itself becomes an active participant in memory, with each ridge, river bend, or clearing serving as a mnemonic device. The intertwining of physical geography and cultural practice illustrates a subtle, sustained mechanism for historical continuity. Even the names of places, rivers, hills, and settlements carry resilience. Despite imposed English or European designations, local Cherokee communities retain endonyms alongside modern names, a dual language mapping that asserts cultural persistence and identity. For example, the area surrounding modern-day Dalton, Georgia, remains referenced in Cherokee as Unalehu, meaning Valley of Echoes, signifying both the natural topography and the echo of past lives that once inhabited the space. Through these practices, the memory of the Trail of Tears remains present yet integrated into daily life. Families recount survival strategies, leadership of Ross and other elders, and communal efforts to maintain cohesion. These narratives are not dramatized for effect. They are embedded in ordinary acts of remembrance, from tending graves and teaching songs to naming children after places and ancestors. The cadence of life itself becomes testimony, a rhythm sustaining knowledge and connection across generations. Reflecting academically, the Cherokee experience demonstrates that memory preservation does not rely solely on written archives. Place-based rituals, oral tradition, and ongoing engagement with the environment constitute living history, bridging displacement, trauma, and continuity. The interplay between land memory and cultural practice offers insights into how communities maintain identity in the face of coercion and environmental displacement. The voices of those who remain speak in subtler ways in prayer song, tending of graves, retention of endonyms, and the careful guidance of children along ancestral paths. These voices, though quiet, echo across time, offering a nuanced understanding of history that emphasizes endurance, adaptation, and the interconnection between land and identity. Ultimately, the Cherokee present-day communities remind us that history is neither fully lost nor fully imposed. It persists in gestures and rituals and melodies, and in the very names of the land. By observing, participating, and listening, both descendants and scholars can trace the contours of survival memory and cultural resilience, witnessing how the past continues to inform the present without spectacle, yet with enduring clarity. The land may have been lost, but memory persisted through songs, rituals, and stories. How do you think communities today can preserve the memory of events like the Trail of Tears? Discuss in the comments.